Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Portland protests, because this is something that happened between the last time I was on the air and now is these Portland protests really blew up. I mean, it's been happening for a while. And what I wanted to do is, first of all, I want to put a general caveat because I know tensions are high on this. So how I'm going to approach this is I'm not going to get into individual acts of I saw this Twitter video or that video, except for very few specific cases. And the goal here is not to legislate who is or who isn't the bad actor at an individual, isolate on a tweet level. I think a lot of times when people try and argue that, they're trying to, rather than seek to understand, they're seeking to be right. And they want to say, well, this video proves that my side is right and your side is wrong. I'm going to try and take a different view to provide some context on this and talk about an aggregate. We may use one or two specific examples. And also remember the rules. Everyone behave yourselves. I got my ban page up. If someone jumps in and starts saying nonsense, you don't need to go back at them. I'll take care of them. Don't worry about it. So just everyone be kind to each other and we'll get through this. So Portland is a great example of the accidental guerrilla dynamic. And I've been talking about accidental guerrilla for years now. This is a theory that comes out of counterinsurgency. It was originally proposed by David Kukulin, who's probably one of the best counterinsurgency theorists in the world. And I wanted to, when I talk about context, everyone's down in the Twitter and the images. There's a system structure to what happened in Portland. And this system structure is common. It's ubiquitous all over the world, whether we're talking about insurgencies or nonviolent protests. It's called this accidental guerrilla syndrome. And I wanted to walk through how that structure develops and then show it in action in Portland, because I think Portland's a really good example of it in effect. So what I'm going to do is hop over here to Vensim, where I do a lot of my modeling. So I apologize for all the tools and stuff. This is kind of like going in the lab, a little bit. And what these are showing is feedback structures. And those who have seen this before, these are feedback loops. And what I'm going to do is walk through this feedback structure and try and explain piece by piece how this builds. And then we'll see how it played out in Portland. So as in all systems, we're going to start arbitrarily just for the point of reference. We're going to talk about radicals integrating in a near space. And a near space here could be physical, like a city or town, or it could be conceptual, like where I am. The near space is the locality that the radicals are integrating in. And by integrate, I mean they're part of the community. They've been there for a while. They have relationships. They may be residents, or they may even have familiarity, but they're integrating in this community. They're not outsiders. They're locals to that. And being radicals, they're going to do provocations. That's what radical means, right? Whether you look at Black Lives Matter or the Sons of Liberty or any of these groups, part of radical, civil protest and civil disturbance is to provoke and create a response. And again, we've talked on the edges here. Sometimes in those crowds, you have some bad actors that are doing some bad stuff. These are very complex situations, but the point of a radical action is to raise awareness through a provocation. And so what you see here is as the radicals integrate in the near space, they create provocations. And those provocations lead to the growth in radicals. More people get aware, more people get activated. They join that effort. So here we go. As provocations increase, right, instability increases. And as instability increases, this may lead to a near intervention. I'm using near and far here to identify both a geographical space in the context of Portland or a conceptual space if you want to use this somewhere else. This could be entirely virtual, but my Reddit channel or my InfoMullet community is my near space, but the far space might be Reddit overall or people on the internet. So near here intervention are forces that are near, the local police, the local community. As instability rises, they're going to want to do interventions which will reduce the provocations, and this creates a limits to growth. It's a classic structure. Nothing can grow forever. It's going to find its limits. So here you have this tug and pull that's creating, there is growth in the radicals with their provocations, but there's also limits. And what drives those limits is the tolerance in the near space for this particular form of instability. So as instability increases, it decreases the tolerance for that instability, which in turn leads to an increased desire for near interventions. Now, this little hash mark here is a symbol for time delay. These feedback structures don't all happen in an instant, and it's what makes complex systems really, really tricky, is that this is a delayed response. So if these radicals integrating the near space are causing a massive amounts of instability that is no longer being tolerated by the community, it's going to show, but it's going to take time. And during that time, there may not be as many near interventions, so there's more provocations and more radicals. But if they reach a threshold of we're done with you, we're not going to tolerate this anymore, that's when you might see this actually increase, which leads to more interventions. And these interventions need not be police. They could be community-based pressure of, hey, knock that out, guys. We're tired of this. We're done with this, right? So this is a limited near space interaction that's going on in Portland. And what happened is with the George Floyd protests, and we'll see in the next chart when I go through the actual numbers, this was going on from the beginning of the George Floyd protests. There were nightly protests, often centered on the Justice Center there in downtown Portland, which happens, very important for our story, to be next door to a federal courthouse. That's key, and we'll come in later. But this is what was going on. It's all local. It's all in the near space. It's all happening there in Portland. It's in a limited area downtown, largely confined between the protesters and the police and going back and forth. But then, as instability arises, what triggers the accidental guerrilla syndrome is that there's a desire to aggressively intervene by a far actor. The far actor is one who doesn't live in this space. It's not integrated in that space. It's not local. It's perceived as the far actor. In this case, it was the federal government. As President Trump declared an executive order, we're going to protect the courthouses. We're going to do this. They ordered in the federal agents. And the key here is an aggressive intervention. You can actually have far actors supporting the near actors and doing what are called civil affairs type work. You know, they're supporting, but it's not aggressive. But this dynamic here in green is an aggressive intervention. And what happens is it's the goal of the aggressive intervention is to fix, right? The visible system. Think of this as a visible system. I'm seeing the instability of the nightly protests, and I'm seeing, it's technically arson, but a lot of these fires you could put out with your feet. It's graffiti. This is upsetting. People get upset. I see that in the visible system, so I'm going to go intervene, and I'm going to fix the visible system. This near intervention loop isn't working to my satisfaction. The time delay, I haven't allowed enough, whatever the cause. I'm going to intervene to reduce the instability. And this is a fix. It's intended to fix the problem. The problem is it's only half of what's called a fixes that fail structure. And fixes that fail are a specific kind of system structure where you put in place a fix to the visible system that in a short term seems to be working, but in the long term is creating an accumulation of unintended consequences that actually erode the benefit you think you're getting. And in this case, as you aggressively intervene by the far actor, you trip these accidental guerrillas. And an accidental guerrilla is someone who is in the near space. It's not a protester, right? A protester's out there, they're activated, they're radical. But the accidental guerrilla is seeing someone who's the far actor coming into their space and being like, hey, wait a minute. What are you doing here? We got this. This is local. We don't need you involved. And I use the analogy, if you've ever seen a family, like a rancher family or a farm family, something with like 5 boys or maybe a mix of boys or girls, that family will fight constantly. Like you go to a high school and you got 4 of those kids in high school or 5 of those kids in high school throughout the different years, right? Whatever, through the school system, they'll be fighting each other all the time. That's the conflict of the near actors. They're all siblings. But any outside actor picks on one of those 5 and the entire family comes together and reacts to the outside actor. And the technical term is called segmented lineage. And it gives rise to like these sayings you hear in the Arab world: me against my brother and I against my cousin and I against the world. It's a series of these recognitions that as you go from the near space and a far actor comes in it, you can activate local actors and that's why they're called accidental guerrillas. They didn't start out intending to be protesters or radicals. They are accidental in that they are reacting to the intervention of the far actor. And what this does is as that aggressive intervention increases, the number of accidental guerrillas increase. And that actually causes more instability because you've got more people, more protesters. Now it's just not the radicals you were dealing with. And you saw this in Portland, like the mom's wall and the veterans wall and the dads with leaf blowers and the bold, all these different groups that came into the protests, weren't there originally, but came in when they saw this reaction. And this creates a fixes that fail. Also, some of these accidental guerrillas over time become radicalized. If I'm a Navy veteran and I go up and talk to the officers and they break my hand and they put me in the hospital, I might become radicalized by that experience. So the interaction, some accidental guerrillas eventually become radicals and join that because they've been radicalized by the interaction with this aggressive response. And this, by the way, this is not limited to just protest. This is exactly what happened in Afghanistan. You know, you think about how does a Taliban of a couple thousand people in 2005 end up with 80,000 fighters by 2010, 2011? It's this dynamic. It's that a lot of Afghans weren't for the Taliban, but when we had an upsurge or the resurge of moving in heavy into Helmand province and areas like that in 2008, 2009, and began the surge, they saw a much more robust U.S. response like, hey, these foreign actors are coming into our area. We're going to pick up arms and resist them. This is a very key dynamic to understand in any sort of asymmetric conflict. So this fixes that fail is now operating in tandem with this limits to growth. And what happens is over time, there's a potential here of what's called the rejection of the far actor. So this near space tolerance for instability, these are what's called the battle of narratives. You can see here on the left, they reject the narrative on the radicals. On the right, they reject the narrative of the far actor. And this is what we talk about asymmetric conflict being a battle between narratives of the near radical group and the far actor, and the population is going to choose between those. And if they choose to reject the far actor, they're going to act as a limit to exert, to the extent they can, a limit to that aggressive intervention. And as the aggressive intervention, and all of these things are happening simultaneously. It's an endogenous system. It's Now, I've simplified. There's a couple things we could add for additional complexity, but nuance. But this is the core of an accidental guerrilla system structure. And you can actually see it play out in live time with the protest size. So this is, I have a tool that lets me find protest sizes. And so just to clear the chart, again, I always like to clear the chart first. This shows the protest size in Portland overlaid into those phases of the accidental guerrilla dynamic. And on the left side is an estimated protest size. Now, from past work, this is an AI tool. It's aggregating news reports. And I found that it's often underestimating by about 1 to 4. So when you see something up here of 2,000, that could be between 2,000 and 8,000 and 10,000 people. But this is the size of protest based on these estimates. And these gap days here are just lack of reporting. I wouldn't say they were 0 because we know they were protesting every night, but you can kind of look at the peaks here and get a sense. So the George Floyd protests begin right as we head into Memorial Day weekend, right? And you can see they're large, they're small. You have a big protest action here. You have a bridge march. These were the provocations. We can call this the provocation period, right? This is when the protesters are out there doing those nightly protests. And they're, I'm not going to get into legislating each little act, but this is what I would call the provocation phase, right? They're out there, they're maintaining, but you can see it's decreasing in size over time, which is very natural. Energy dissipates, attention gets focused elsewhere. You end up with a hard group left, but the large popular support, it's hard to maintain. It's hard to mobilize mass populations. But then in green here, this is the initial intervention, and this is when the federal agents are sent in on July 4th. Now, look, it's very low here with a few spikes by this point. There's not a lot of protesters. And during this intervention, I don't think the country was aware of it. You were certainly aware of it in Portland, but I've marked this this phase point here, this phase transition. Actually, on July 11th, there was a protester who took a hammer claw to some federal agents. Like, he was up by the door, and as soon as they came out, he tried to swing his hammer. That was an aggressive action that I think clearly criminal. Guy needs to go to jail. But 2 days later, the reason most people don't know that is 2 days later, a peaceful protester was shot in the head by non-lethal impact rounds, sent to the hospital in critical condition. And I've used that date to mark what I would call the aggressive interaction here. And this aggressive intervention is a much more robust presence. You get the people, the federal agents in what looks like military gear, the camouflage, you see the unmarked vans and the arrests and all that, and I'll get into that in a bit here. But this phase, you can see this transition phase here, and I marked it the day that the protester got shot in the head. And look what happens. The accidental guerrilla dynamic kicks off, and all of a sudden you've got your veteran wall of veterans, your dads with leaf blowers, your wall of moms, your looky-loos are coming in who have been, they may have been considering getting involved throughout this time, but this is where they finally show up, and all of a sudden your protest sizes are much larger than they were. This is why the accidental guerrilla dynamic is important. A lot of these protesters are only reacting to the aggressive intervention by the far actor in the near space. You go through the accidental guerrilla dynamic and you get to the final phase, which is the rejection of the federal far actor. This is when the governor and Vice President Pence came to an agreement. The federal agents agreed to withdraw from confrontation. There's been a little confusion. It's not like they've left the city. They're still in the courthouse, but they're no longer engaging in that direct aggressive intervention with the protesters on a nightly basis. And that's cut the dynamic. That's cut the accidental guerrilla dynamic. And you see a sharp drop off. Now the data I had only goes through August 2nd, sort of end of July, August. So it's only capturing the first few days, but you see this sharp drop off. And if we looked at this in a couple days, I would imagine that again, the size of the crowds may be a little higher than this low period because you've radicalized some of those accidental guerrillas, but it's going to be much smaller and much more manageable than it was during the midst of this accidental guerrilla outbreak. And that shows you the danger of this. So let me go back and ask some questions here, if there's any questions on the system structure before we get into like the detail analysis of the unmarked vans and the arrest. Yeah, by the way, welcome to a couple folks here showing up. Kevin Lane definitely has behavior issues. Agree, Kevin, good to see you. Ms. Falconberry is asking, would a provocative government response also be considered a growth of radicalism, or is a radical response? Not sure how to word this. No. So in this case, we identify with operational terms the near actor and the far actor. And in this case, we isolate and say the radicalism is a exhibited trait of the near actor. We could describe the, I think I prefer the term aggressive for federal rather than calling it radical. We could call it radical in the operational term of it's a departure from the norm, but that causes confusion when people are like, what's radical and what's not. So when we do these system structures, we pick terms and we isolate them into things to say, here's the near actor and here's the far actor, and try and avoid duplication of terms that can cause confusion. Now, clearly you could describe the federal action as a radical action because it's not been done before. It's not a traditional response. This is, you know, when this accidental guerrilla dynamic kicked off in the Bundy standoff in BLM, the BLM initially went in hot and heavy. They had dogs, they had tasers, they were really aggressive, and boom, like that, a couple hundred people, maybe even 1,000 people showed up overnight, and this is in southern Nevada. The BLM withdrew. They wisely withdrew. The normal reaction of since at least Waco and Ruby Ridge and the move in Philadelphia and some of these bad incidences, the normal reaction to this kind of provocation is to give them room, isolate it, contain it, let the energy dissipate. You have the Mahler wildlife refugee, which I can never spell correctly, so Lucas will correct my spelling. They seized this federal property, but the FBI largely encircled them, waited them out over the winter, waited for their energy to dissipate. There are ways of managing this, but certainly the federal reaction in this is a radical departure, but we don't call it radical because we're trying to avoid the confusion between terms and the different sides of the actors. John Custis is talking about Egypt, Morsi, Sisi, all classic example of these points. Security becomes an overarching concern. Exactly. So, and I think some specific cases in Egypt, you obviously had Morsi overreact to the Arab Spring. He lost his position. Sisi comes in after effectively a coup and absolutely brutally crushes down on the Muslim Brotherhood. But now you've created this accidental guerrilla network, and it just caused problems in Egypt. Tyler, good that you're following along. Yeah, so Ms. Falconberry, would social media protests sometimes count as radical protests? Yes, so this is why the structure is ubiquitous. I've framed it in this context of Portland, but you can think of near space as my Facebook page, right? And I can tell you this from example. I can watch the accidental guerrilla dynamic play off, right? We are all debating in my social media space, my Facebook page, we're having good debates, and then someone comes in and picks up the ball, and they're rude to people, and all of a sudden everyone else is like getting up in arms. They become accidental guerrillas because some outsider has come into our space, and even though we have our disagreements, we tend to coalesce around our own, and that they begin reacting to that far space. And you can see this. So these spaces, near space and far space, they can be entirely conceptual. It can be my Facebook page versus the internet. It can be a Reddit community. It can be an a gaming club, a gaming club, a lot of us folks here are gamers, are like, the gaming club obviously has a lot of struggle and dissent, but that's internal. And when an outsider comes in and criticizes it, they circle the wagons. There's a lot of ways you can play with the structural dynamic. That's why it's ubiquitous. It's called a generic structure. The terms in those feedback loops may change a little bit to kind of clarify what you're talking about, but the general system structure remains consistent. Kevin's asking, it would be interesting to overlay this framework with future protests to predict conflict instances or even injuries. I'd imagine there's a predictive value. Kevin, there is an amazing predictive value. If you saw on my Facebook, I was saying that very early on, I was saying DHS is not tall enough for this ride. And it's because I'm very familiar with the accidental guerrilla dynamic. And I saw it playing out in live time. And I knew, I don't know for sure. I'm not Nostradamus over here. I can't do that level of bad poetry. But I know I've seen this dynamic play out. And I'm like, DHS is not tall enough for the ride. They're biting off more than they can chew. They're activating this dynamic, and you can see where it's going to go. Likewise, John's talking about Egypt. You can use these to analyze foreign events. You can use them to analyze situations abroad. It's the key thing to remember is it's not these generic structures. If we sat down for a couple hours, they can manifest many different kinds of behaviors. It's not all foreordained to be one thing. For example, if the radical actor hasn't integrated in the near space, the near space isn't going to tolerate them, and they're going to choose that narrative to increase interventions. You may never get to a far space intervention. So there's a lot of permutations that can occur. But yes, this general framework has forecasting power. And that's the reason I use them. I actually use them in my profession. Trisha, I'm going to pause on that one about the administration motivations. How is this policy decided upon? Well, I'll just go in there. And my opinion is that the administration was looking for campaign benefit, some electoral points, and they wanted to show that they were being tough on crime and reacting, with this instability that is occurring side by side with the George Floyd protests. And that was the cause of the intervention. People will argue that and say, well, no, there's a legitimate need to protect the courthouses. I'm going to get into that in a bit here as in this next section, but that's just, I think what they were hoping, if I were advising DHS, I would have totally advised them to do something different. There's a path, knowing the accidental guerrilla dynamic, there's one path to effectively create stability. But if your goal is to get election benefit, or to show you're being tough on a liberal city, or to break apart Antifa because you consider them a dangerous group, then you might take a different route. But these are not, I want to be careful that this structure isn't just limited to Portland. The US and Iraq really tripped off the accidental guerrilla as well, because of the way we behaved initially when we're dealing with the citizens. This can happen, and it's also blue folks on the blue side have to be careful about this dynamic as well. I'm sure it happens in a lot of social justice groups where you have conflicts that end up, this debate about cancel culture, all these things. You can use this paradigm to understand, as long as you can identify near space and far space, near actor and far actor, and have a fairly good objective read, as in you have some distance, you're not too close to it, as to which side is doing what. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the Info Mullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the Info Mullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.